to take a minute to introduce our guest speaker for today. So we are privileged to have with us Dr. Kathleen Vogel. In just a moment, I think there's some background noise here. Sure, everyone is muted themselves. Okay. So once again, we're privileged to have with us Dr. Kathleen Vogel. She's an associate professor of public policy here at the University of Maryland, and she also is a senior fellow at CISM, which is the Center for International and Security Studies. She's also served as a researcher at the Turing Institute in London, and also as a Jefferson Science Fellow in the U.S. Department of State. She's also the author of a book called Phantom Menace or Looming Danger, a new framework for assessing bioweapons threats. And she also has her PhD in the sciences. She has a PhD in biological chemistry from Princeton. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Vogel, and I'll turn it over to you to share what you have prepared.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's so great just to have a chance to chat a little bit with folks who are interested in science and technology policy. It definitely brings me back to memories of when I was kind of first starting to think about this, going down this career path. So I'm happy today to share with you essentially what my experiences have been and ways that I could see if students are interested in getting into this area, what might be some different ways that students can get involved. But I'm also just happy to answer questions as well too about anything you might be interested in. So I would say at the outset, probably the first kind of take-home message I would have is there are many ways that you could get involved in science and technology policy issues as a career path. If you're interested in that, there are different opportunities in government and academia and industry, think tanks, NGOs, and I've probably through most of my career experiences, I've probably hit most of those. I'm not a traditional academic in that sense, and that I've often tried different kinds of work experiences in the science and technology policy area. So I can definitely chat a little bit about what my experiences have been in those settings and how they compare and contrast. And I would say in terms of a career path, a lot of it is sort of finding an environment that works best for you as a person. Some of that may relate to whether you're more of an introvert or an extrovert, whether you might like to do and stay more in really doing technical work versus moving much more into science policy, science communication areas. So there's a whole host of differences in different settings for how you might do science policy. I would say one other thing just to keep in mind, if folks don't already realize, it's definitely a much less structured career path than, let's say, the traditional science path, where if you go into industry or academia, it's very clear kind of what you need to do to set yourself up for success. Career paths usually do a postdoc or do some type of rotation, and then it's, you build from there. It's much more clear and a known pathway. I would say in the science and technology policy area, from my own experiences, as well as colleagues of mine, across different universities have also entered in this career path. Different people do it differently. So there's not sort of one clear, multiple ones. And some of it sort of being open to trying different settings out, trying different experiences out, and sort of learning as you go along what you like and what you don't like. I think for me, my experience has been, it's been very useful to be in different settings to sort of figure that out, because when I entered into this career path, I didn't know what the heck it was or what it meant when you did S&T policy. What does that actually mean? What do you do day to day? So sometimes you just have to sort of try things out and then learn from those. And even if they're not the best experiences, I would say that they're still very useful experiences, at least in my case. It's been very useful. Even have less than great experiences, it just tells you something about what you like or don't like about a particular work environment. Those are just some kind of overarching pieces that I could share. I'm going to try and share my screen. I do have just one PowerPoint slide just to kind of talk a little bit through some of my own work experiences. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this. I use more Zoom rather than
There's a button at the bottom of the screen, kind of next to where the mute and the camera button are. Yeah, you got it. Great.
Okay, can you see it? Oh, here, maybe. Oh, here. Okay. Can you see the screen? Can you see my slide? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just give you a little bit of background about how I got into the science and technology policy area. So I was in graduate school doing my PhD in biophysical chemistry, and I pretty much realized kind of midway through that, even though I found my lab work interesting, I realized I really did not want to spend 12 hours of my day in a laboratory. I just realized that. But the problem was, and maybe some of you who are in the sciences and engineering might have faced similar things, academia is pretty bad about telling you about alternative career paths. And so really there was very little information. I knew that I didn't want to go into an industry or an academic science career path, but there really wasn't much information about what else you can do, beyond that. And so it just so happened, just talking to other graduate students at the time who felt similarly in my chemistry department, I sort of came across some students who basically had decided to do some science policy courses at the public policy school on campus. And I was like, oh, science policy, what is that? Tell me more. I have no idea what this is. So I basically was talking to them, and I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I don't know anything about this area, but I'm curious maybe to check it out. So I decided to sign up for one science policy course, and I was basically doing it on the sly. Probably many of you in sciences know if you have a PI, he expects lab work. You kind of, if you're going to explore some other things, you might have to do it kind of on the side and not letting them know exactly what you're doing in case they may not approve. So I basically, took this kind of course on the side. It was kind of an introductory science and technology policy course. That just, kind of gave a lay of the land about these issues. And I remember during that course, we hit on one module that was on security issues on weapons of mass destruction. And it was really interesting because I had never in my life had thought about weapons of mass destruction, how my background might connect to it, but they had a section on chemical and biological weapons issues, and I was oddly fascinated by this and about how I might be able to apply my technical background to these policy issues. So I took another course kind of through that. Then I got connected to a faculty member who had actually a joint appointment in the public policy school, as well as he was a physics faculty member, and he specialized in nuclear weapons policy issues. He'd worked in the White House on these issues in the past. And so he basically became an informal mentor to me, and basically told me and revealed to me, well, if you're in science policy, there's this whole world out there of different opportunities and career paths. And it really just opened my eyes. And I would say if it wasn't for him, his name was Frank von Hippel, I don't know that I would have known about just the whole range of different opportunities. And I also was able to get involved in his research group. He had a policy research group with a variety of different postdocs and grad students and visiting researchers working on mostly nuclear weapons policy issues. But again, since I was more interested in the chemical and biological, he included me in that. They had, weekly meetings. And again, it was a way for me to kind of start learning more about policy issues in this area. I worked on a kind of a small research project with him on the side. And then he basically said, well, there are policy postdocs where you're not working in a lab, but you're actually doing policy work. And I was like, really? Tell me more. And so there are a number of different places around the US, as well as some internationally, where if you want to do more of a science policy experience as a postdoc, you can do them. And so I made the decision after finishing graduate school that I would do a policy postdoc, and that was my first experience. And it was at a think tank based out in California called the Monterey Institute of International Studies. They had a Center for Nonproliferation Studies where they specialized on chemical and biological weapons issues. And I would say that was the first experience where I really got rooted and grounded, surrounded by people essentially working on these issues, had my own research project that I was working on, was able to interface a lot more with policy folks. And I would say that was really the first place where I sort of cut my teeth on policy issues. And that was a year-long experience. And I would say after that, I became a little bit of a nomad. For me, I enjoyed that experience, but I will say that my own experience is not typical. And I would say if you don't want to move around, you don't have to follow this career path. But for me, I've actually found moving around is quite useful to learn and to develop different kinds of professional networks. And so after that experience in California, I then spent a year, from there I went for 2.5 years to Cornell University, where I did another postdoc, a second postdoc. And this is where I really developed, I would say, my expertise on biological weapons, biosecurity issues, really doing a lot of my own independent research there. And then after that experience, I was curious to experience a different kind of environment. So then I spent a year working out at Sandia National Labs. One thing just to be aware, National Labs, in addition to having technical positions, they also, some of them, particularly in the security area and they may in the environmental area also, have different policy-oriented postdocs. And so I did a year at a policy postdoc at Sandia National Labs. Which again was a very interesting experience because it was in a national lab setting. I got to see more of what that looked like. It was a lot more team-based work where I was working on a team on biosecurity issues. We had a workshop that you see picture there. We organized with different US and international experts looking at dangerous pathogens. So that was a great experience. And then from that experience, that was also a part-time short-term position. Then, I'd always known that I was curious to see what government work was like. I sort of assumed, when you hear about policy, that really government's where all the action is. You got to get into government. And so I decided after that experience, it would be useful to spend some time in the government. And I did a fellowship at the State Department in the Non-Proliferation Bureau, working in my issue area on biological weapons issues. And that was also really interesting to sort of see how the sausage is made. And it was a useful, because up until that point, I'd been doing more kind of academic work, I would say research academic work, and working in the State Department, it really helped me to see, just the various constraints that come into play on issues that I'd worked on. As an outsider, I was always wondering, why aren't they doing X, Y, or Z? It seems like such a no-brainer. And it's once you get into the government, you have a better understanding, oh, these are the reasons why they can't do that easily, or this is why this decision was made. And so I found that to be a very useful experience, but I also found government work quite frustrating in various ways. There's often not a lot of time to think. The expertise that you bring in is not always, you're not always able to use it because the currency there is quite different. So I knew that I didn't, from that experience, again, although I was very frustrated by that experience, I also found it valuable and useful, not only just to give me a little bit of more of an inside perspective, but also to realize that I really liked doing research. I liked being able to work on research projects. And so it was at that point then that there was an academic position that opened up at back at Cornell University, where I had been previously as a postdoc. And so I took a faculty position there. And I would say from that experience, I identify, and I would really say I'm an academic who does policy work, but I often find it useful for my own research to go in and out of different kinds of settings. So I did another fellowship at the State Department from 2016, and I'm still connected to that office in the State Department. This experience was very different. I decided to work on, we can go into this if you're curious in the Q&A. I decided to work on issues related to human trafficking, so nothing related to my past expertise, but it's actually developed into a new research area that I'm working on now. So I've often, even though I would say I value academia and what it offers, and I'll always probably stay grounded in academia, I do always find it useful to go in and out of government or in and out of different kinds of settings just because I think that can inform your perspective and your work. So again, that just kind of gives you a broad brush stroke about, the kinds of experiences and places where I've been. And I would say, from that, there are a lot of different ways if you're interested in getting involved in science technology policy while you're still in grad school, things that you can do right now and then also just plan for. So there are courses at Maryland in the School of Public Policy on science and technology policy issues. So, I mean, that's essentially how I got, initially interested, is by taking a course and just trying to get a sense of various issues and maybe how my background might connect to policy issues. So I would definitely recommend that if you have a chance. And again, I realize sometimes it is difficult if you're working in a lab and if your advisor may or may not be supportive. That can be challenging, but I think there are ways. Some of these courses are offered in the evening. So again, it could be a way to still take a course if you're interested and still get around maybe the advisor issues if that's an issue. There are also, opportunities if, let's say, you don't want to do a course or can't, but you still might want to do some kind of research. You can always reach out to a faculty member, like my faculty mentor back when I was in grad school, and just say, hey, can I either get involved in a project that you're working on, or could I develop an independent research project with you? Again, it's a way to kind of just start testing the waters a bit in terms of, topics you might be interested in, and then seeing how that translates into some kind of policy report or policy document. And it's also a great way to develop relationships with a mentor. And my mentor, again, at the time in grad school, was really influential in connecting me to the right circles of people that then opened up these opportunities later. I would say without him, I think it would have been a lot more difficult, because he knew the places to go to for postdoc. He knew people to connect me to. So I would say that's also another critical thing, is if you could get connected to a faculty mentor in policy. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be at Maryland. I mean, it's great if it could be local, but there are some other folks that this faculty member in grad school connected me to who were actually based in Boston, who also kind of served as informal mentors to me and gave me advice about, how to get into this. And they were the ones who strongly, because at the time I thought, well, do I need to go back to school to get like a degree in science policy? Do I need to get a master's or PhD? And they were very instrumental in saying, no, you do not have to pick up another degree. There's a lot that you can do just with either a postdoc experience or kind of more on the job training. You don't have to go and get a whole nother degree to get into this field. So that was really useful. There are also these couple of different, what I would call science policy boot camp experiences for graduate students. ASU has one that they offer through their DC campus here every summer. It's like, I think 2 weeks, where basically it's kind of like an intensive introduction to science policy for science and engineering folks. And you also do different kinds of field trips to different agencies and things, just to sort of see more kind of what goes on behind the scenes. So I would recommend those if you can. The downside to those boot camps is they cost money. I would say a few $1,000s. So sometimes graduate programs, it's worth exploring whether either your PI or your graduate program might have some funding that would at least offset some of the cost of attending that program. So again, it's just something to maybe keep in mind. Sometimes there are different ways that you could get at least some of the expenses covered for those things. And I do think that they're useful not only just to learn a bit more, but also just to develop those professional networks. The folks at ASU, for example, are pretty well connected in different parts of policy, so it's just useful to get to know them. There are, also opportunities if you want to do internships. And again, this varies, how you might be able to do this varies by your lab or your program. Some advisors might be open to this, some may not be, so it just depends. But there are different internship programs, and especially here in DC, since Maryland is pretty close to DC, that you could do potentially. There are also some internship experiences, for example, at the national labs that I know of, that people have done. So again, different ways where you could try and get some experiences along the way. And then there are also things like different conferences like the AAAS, the National AAAS meeting that happens every year. It's huge, but they usually, every few years, it usually does come to DC. So it's another one just to keep in mind, because there you'll really see the breadth and the scope of a whole bunch of different policy issues that you could get involved in, and how people are, researching it and talking about it. So again, just different opportunities, and also, checking out different think tanks in DC and different talks that they might sponsor. It's useful, again, just to go to talks if you're curious about an area, just to get a sense of, how people are talking and working on these issues. And since Maryland is close to DC, there could be ways where you could just pop in on some DC talks, and again, just sort of to get an awareness of what's going on. And the School of Public Policy here at Maryland also has different science policy oriented talks. That again could be a way to just get acclimated to what people are working on in the space. So, again, it's just, I would say it's usually a process as you're getting into this, trying to figure out kind of how your expertise connects to a particular policy area. And what really excites you, because I think it should be something that excites you and draws you into this. Then how you might think about pursuing interesting experiences that can set you up for opportunities kind of down the road. There are also the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships, which I'm sure probably several of you have heard about. I would say those are also very good experiences. I never did one of those because I did these other State Department focused policy fellowships, but the AAAS fellowships are a great way to get in, get connected. And people who've done those, some of them have stayed in government, some of them have actually gone out to work at think tanks or at other places. So it is definitely a good experience, if you just kind of want to get your feet wet after grad school. But I would say it is important to develop expertise and experience in a particular policy area, and sometimes that takes just a little bit of time to do. So again, it's just useful to think about with your circumstances, maybe how you might build that. And it's, again, probably going to be unique to you and your where you are at the stage of your career. Again, whether your advisor is open to you, taking time out to do some of these things. But that's just something I would recommend, just to, go to things, try and get some experiences. It's useful to do it if you can before you graduate, but I definitely have known people who've transitioned after grad school who just, for various reasons, couldn't get these experiences in before grad school, and then did more policy postdocs, when they finished, and that was really where they got their grounding. So, and you can always do it later also as well. I would say there's not sort of I would say a time sensitivity to, doing XYZ now, or else you're going to miss the boat. There are different ways that you kind of enter this career path at various time points. So there's a lot of flexibility, which I think is great. Again, it's not the very clearly defined structured path that a lot of people may want, but there are a lot of opportunities to get involved in different ways. And I'm happy also if anyone wants to chat with me about possibilities to chat more about that as well. But I think that's most of kind of what I wanted to say, but I'm definitely happy to answer any questions you guys might have, either about anything I've said or maybe things that I haven't said that you're curious about.
Thanks so much for sharing with us about your experience. And I would welcome others to ask questions if they have them. Thanks to those of you who have already written Stack in the chat. If you have a question, that's the way to do it. So we'll start with Megan. Go ahead and ask a question.
Hi, Dr. Vogel. Thank you so much. It was really, really nice to hear. Very refreshing. I'm a PhD candidate at UNC Greensboro, and my university is really supportive for students going into academic settings, but they have no interest in supporting students who are seeking careers that are not academic. So currently, I've been kind of struggling because I want to go into science policy, but do you have any suggestions for kind of how to tackle these sorts of careers that I'm running into? And any kind of piece of advice? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say unfortunately, and it's a little bit sad to hear this is still the case. I would say what you're experiencing is similar to what I experienced several years ago. And it's unfortunate that in academia, even still in the S&T areas, they haven't realized that not everyone's going to go into academia. And they really need to be training people to fill a whole host of different alternative career paths with science. So I would say it's definitely going to be more on you, or I would say on the individual, to basically carve out the opportunities for yourself if your institution is not set up or your department is not set up to do that. And this is essentially what I had to do, and it was mostly through these kind of informal networks. First, in my case, I was fortunate to know of other graduate students in my department who felt similarly, and then they were a couple years ahead of me, and they had already started taking policy courses. And so they said, well, here, this is what we're doing. Maybe you might want to try this. So that was helpful for me. If you don't have that, I would say it's useful if you're interested in policy to really, I don't know if your school has a school of public policy program at all. Do they?
We don't.
Okay.
We have a political science department, but it's no science policy ever. We have started a science policy group that I'm president of. And again, that's like 5 loyal PhD students who are like, oh, this is great. Nice job. But we really need to like learn from somebody with experience. So yeah.
I mean, I think it's great what you're doing, because even that experience, again, as you're transitioning, that's definitely something you can put down on your resume, your CV, for kind of showing that you are ready to transition to science policy. I would say some other things maybe to think about, and again, I'm thinking off the top of my head, I might think more later. So feel free also to email me if you want to follow up again. But within the UNC system, there are other programs and schools that do have science policy programs. Like I'm thinking, I used to be at NC State, and so there's some folks there in different areas. There's some folks at Chapel Hill. I definitely know at Duke, there's a science policy program there. And so it may be trying to just connect professionally with those places, at least because they're local or I mean, they're not probably as next door, but they're probably within driving distance. So it might be where you could establish maybe some opportunity to go visit there, to talk with people there. And then again, just making those professional connections might be helpful, or maybe even inviting some of those people to give talks at your school, because it's probably within driving distance. They could probably do it with, no cost or minimal cost. So yeah, I mean, it is a little bit more effort when you don't have kind of an institutional base to work from, but I think you're doing the right things. And it's just more keeping on that path. And yeah, I mean, I would just say another quick follow-up. At what stage are you? How close are you to finishing?
I'm a PhD candidate. I just successfully got that like 2 days ago. So I'm really excited.
Okay. So you have a little bit of time.
Yeah,
so you have a little bit of time. So that, I mean, that's better in your favor, just because you have some time then to build on this kind of effort.
Great. I see Sarah in the stack.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland. And since, Dr. Vogel, since you talked about being involved in NGOs, think tanks, academia, national labs, and whatnot, I'm curious on your thoughts on how academic research that we put out as graduate students, how that's used at the various sectors.
Mm-hmm. So I think it varies. I would say it's probably hard for hardcore technical work to be taken up easily by folks in the policy sectors. usually there has to be some kind of translation that happens, that this varies somewhat. So for example, a lot of times think tanks, NGOs are the ones, or even folks in academia, I would say, but on the policy side are the ones who may know of technical work going on in, let's say, a science or engineering department. And then they write an article or a piece that then translates that very technical language into something that's more digestible by policy folks and shows the relevance of that work. So I've seen that often. I mean, there are ways that technical folks can directly get involved, but there definitely usually needs to be some kind of translation process to make work more accessible to policy folks. So probably the best setting where maybe I see that done is like the AAAS meetings, where you often will have technical people giving talks about their work, but they have done the presentation in a way that's more accessible to a wider audience. So I would say meetings like that. There's also this group, I forgot to mention this earlier, called ST Global, which is actually, and this is actually something that might relate to the previous question. There's this group called ST Global that consists of a set of different universities around the US that are specifically geared towards students, whether I think it's undergraduates or graduates interested in science policy. They have an annual conference where you can present work in this space. Now, there's an interesting story connected to ST Global. There are some folks here on campus, including myself, who are interested in bringing ST Global to Maryland and having Maryland be a partner. However, you have to, I think institutions have to commit to, it might be something like $5,000 to be an institutional member of ST Global. And unfortunately, we couldn't get any departments or units at Maryland that we asked to be willing to be, commit the funds to be an institutional partner. That doesn't mean that you can't participate. Like as a student, you can still plug into that group. It just means that Maryland as an institution is not a formal partner to that. So I would say ST Global is another way if you're, again, just interested in initially trying to get your ideas and presenting it in a more policy context. It's the ST Global conferences, they're all students. So it's a very low stress, low key way to kind of present your research and get feedback from, other students also interested in policy.
Great. Addie?
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Addie. I'm a PhD candidate in the entomology department. So we've already talked a little bit about the reluctance that scientists can have with the idea of even getting into policy. And I feel like one of the things I hear often is that scientists should be neutral and they should just do their research and then they should let someone else deal with it. Could you speak to that a little bit? Like how to respond to that sort of thinking or really that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I would say from my background, I understand that perspective, but I think it's not realistic. Scientists, science just even of itself can be political, so the fact that somehow scientists can stand off in this very removed state, I think is not realistic. Although again, it's a popular perspective of how scientists should operate. I think that one can encounter that, and you can encounter resistance then to entering into policy. But I would say there are a lot of examples of scientists who have used their knowledge to inform policy in ways that I think can be seen as rational and grounded in evidence. And just speaking of entomology, one person that I'm thinking of who I think is a great example of this is Fred Gould at NC State. He's been, he's a straight up, hardcore entomologist, has gotten a lot of scientific awards, but he's also been very influential as a National Academies of Science committee member where, he's been on a lot of different committees looking at policy issues, for example, around genetic engineering, gene editing, things like that. And, he's someone who I think is a great example of how you can be a scientist, but still engaged in policy issues, but bringing that you know, your scientific knowledge and understanding to bear on policy issues.
Great, thank you so much.
Adam, I see you in the stack.
Yeah, hi. Thanks again, Dr. Vogel, for taking time to do this. I'm a PhD student in physics at Maryland here. So I guess I just wanted to ask, like, some of the like academic advice, I guess, that I've received about postdocs is that you should sort of look for something that's like outside of your like specific area of expertise, but like not like create like super far away from what you like did your PhD research on. I was maybe wondering if you could speak to sort of like some advice about how that maybe changes or doesn't change when if you're like looking for a policy postdoc, because that like the policy side is sort of already pretty far outside of your expertise. But it may be hard to like find something that's like specifically related to like exactly what my research is on. So
yeah, so I mean, I've seen different people do this successfully in different ways, so I wouldn't say there's one model to follow. So in terms of, let's say, if you want to go into like a policy postdoc, if your research is such that there are already some pretty clear policy issues around that, like I'm thinking probably environmental, you work like on climate change science or something, that would probably be they're pretty, I wouldn't say easy, but more clear and direct ways that you can connect a policy postdoc to something like that, because there are several around the country where you can do that. And I would say it's probably easier if you can make that connection, just because then you don't have to do a lot of relearning or retooling. In the postdoc, you can sort of kind of move much more quickly into applying your technical knowledge to policy. I would say in my case, I was probably the opposite in that, so my PhD research project was using resonance Raman spectroscopy to study heme-based proteins. There's really very little to no policy issues that are focused directly on that. So basically, in my case, it was the more general category of biological sciences, molecular biology. Those are some things that I had worked with in the lab and sort of had generalized expertise in those domains, that then when I looked then at the policy issues that interested me, and I was very much interested in, oddly enough, in chemical and biological weapons, you know, it wasn't that I had experience in those weapons issues as a graduate student, but I did have enough biological and chemical expertise that would enable me then to, for example, to think critically when people start talking about the science behind these weapons. I had background to sort of evaluate and assess, does that make sense? What are people missing? What are people not talking about? So I would say, you know, there's that way too, where you can enter into a policy postdoc. If your technical area is maybe too narrow, you can sort of broaden it into kind of the general category of, in your case, maybe a physics related understanding or more a physical science related understanding of the policy issue, and transition to that as a postdoc. I would say in that case, there is definitely going to be some retooling that you need to do. In my case, these postdocs that I did, the first postdoc and then the second postdoc really grounded me then into actually specializing in this security area. But it took at least a year after grad school to kind of, again, relearn and retool, get up to speed on sort of the chemical and biological weapons landscape. Before then, I probably felt like I was competent in that area, but you can do that in a year or two. You know, it doesn't take long to do that. And again, my experience and others that I know who've done that transitioning, it's definitely doable, but you do have to recognize you are going to need a year or two to do that.
great, thank you.
Nicole, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you, Rachel. Hi, Dr. Vogel. My name is Nicole Catanzari, and I'm a PhD student in the Neuroscience and Cognitive Science program. I was wondering about your transition back into academia. So a lot of times I hear, and I think probably the other students hear, that if you leave academia, you can't, or it can be very challenging to go back. And I guess it makes a lot of sense for you to be working in public policy now. Do you think that would it be possible or challenging for you to have gone back into academia on the science side, like back into biophysics or chemistry where you were originally trained?
Yeah, I mean, I will say it's funny when I think about how I returned to academia. When I finished my PhD, I'm like, oh, academia, I got to get out of here. I can't go back. I just have no interest in going back. You know, I had absolutely no interest at all going back into academia. So I find it very funny and ironic that that's kind of where I've chosen to go back to. But it's in part because of coming back into academia. It's in a policy, and I've been actually in different departments. I should mention that. In coming back into academia, so prior to being at Maryland, I was 2 years at NC State where I was in a political science department. And then before that, I was at Cornell in an interdisciplinary department called Science and Technology Studies. So I've been in different kinds of academic departments, but none of them are in the physical or natural sciences. And I think that is, I would say it's extremely rare if you leave your PhD academic discipline of sciences, and go into policy, it is very difficult to go back to that same scientific discipline. There are people who have done it, or for example, who might have joint appointments, let's say with a policy school as part of their appointment, and then part of their appointment is in physics or in some other science department. But I would say it's rare. And so you do need to be aware that it's probably, if you do leave your scientific discipline, you might still think about going into academia, you're probably going to be in a very different kind of department. It'll probably be more a public policy school, or maybe political science, or maybe science communications department. And that's where I've seen most people that I know who have technical backgrounds who've gone back into academia. It's usually something like that, one of those kind of academic departments where they're sort of a science person on faculty in a policy school. So it definitely is possible to go back into academia, but I think it's useful to think about. It's probably going to be a very different kind of academic department than you were trained in. And so the culture is going to be different. The publication and the expectations for tenure are going to be very different. So you just have to get used to the different expectations if you do go back into academia.
Great. I see Shantam.
Hi, Dr. Vogel. Thank you so much for your presentation today. And so my question was regarding something you said. So you said that when you were doing your government work, that like your prior experience hadn't been as useful as you thought it was, and like the currency was a little different or something like that. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so it's so funny. And this is why I always say I always recommend a government experience if you have the opportunity, because it's regardless of how the experience ends up, it's always informative. So the first experience that I had at the State Department was working in the Non-Proliferation Bureau on chemical and biological weapons issues. So it was, at that point, I already had developed quite a bit of expertise. I was very knowledgeable about the issues that I was working on in that office. And it was very useful to sort of see, like I said, how the sausage is made. It was also in some ways very frustrating because the tempo of operation in government, at least in that office, was really fast. Like you come into the office, you never know, okay, what fire is going to be happening that you're going to have to devote. You thought you were going to work on something. You come into the office and the rest of your day is like frantically running around trying to deal with some task that a senior official has said he needs like in an hour or in 2 hours. And so, one of my frustrations was just that I had all of this expertise to sort of focus on particular problems that were in that office, but there was basically there was often no bandwidth to really think hard about those issues in the office because there's always some kind of fire going on every day. And so it was just a very stressful work environment. And I just felt there wasn't the opportunity to kind of reflect and to sometimes make the best policies because there was just always all these other issues going on. At the same time, that was very useful to see, because then it helped me to understand as an with my academic hat, why things didn't get done or why things were skewed in certain ways. You really saw up close, like all the politics and the, all of these things that come into play on policy issues. It's not always about the best idea, but sometimes it's about all these kind of internal issues that are going on, or sometimes foreign government issues. Like I had a chance to sort of, see that play out, also when dealing with foreign governments, sometimes they can be difficult and problematic and not wanting to work with you. And, so, in academia, the currency is kind of like the best idea, like intellectually, like what's the best approach. But in government, it's more pragmatic, like what can you get done? I think one of the phrases that I often heard folks at the time that I worked with, I say it is like the perfect is the enemy of the good. And like, you could have this perfect idea that really just, sounds fantastic, but you could never implement it, or it would just be so costly or difficult. So I would say I found that environment frustrating. There were also internal politics in terms of supervisors and higher ups that were often very difficult people to work with. That also created a negative experience. And some of those people, for example, were threatened by my PhD and the fact that I had all this expertise. They were threatened by that. And so then that made a very sometimes negative work environment. So it was this interesting situation where this area where I had all this expertise that I could have brought to bear was sort of thwarted and frustrated in different ways. And so I would say that's something to sometimes just be aware of when you go into government settings. That can happen. I would say, however, in my more recent experience working at State in 2016 in this Office of Human Trafficking, which I have no expertise in, it was a very different office environment. It's been an amazing experience. It sort of redeemed my initial State Department experience. So that's where I would say it's always useful to give things a couple of different tries, because sometimes there are just some unique factors unique to that one situation that doesn't mean that every experience is going to be like that. And so my second experience in the State Department has been just amazing group of people, really supportive, who they value expertise, great management, so very different kind of environment. I would say still the currency, I would say, is still the same in that it's not as a high tempo as the previous office I worked in, but the tempo is quicker, and so you don't always have time to implement and think through the best idea. And again, that's just part of, you just have to realize that going to government, that's the tempo and the currency is what values, and that is going to drive the issue. And it's not always about the best idea that you have.
I'll put a final.
Thank you so much.
I'll put a final call out there for questions. You can add them to the stack. And in the meantime, I have a quick follow-up question from that one. I often hear think tanks sort of describe themselves as a kind of a conduit between the research or the science that happens like at the university and sort of where policy decisions get made, whether they're working directly with government officials or agencies. Do you, in your experience with think tanks, do you find that to be true, or sort of like the question about maybe what are the pros and cons of working in that nexus space over and against like your position now in a school of public policy? What are some of the differences between them, and do you see some advantages working in it for a think tank?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I see value in all of these different entities, and it really just is more based on what personally appeals to you. So at think tanks, they're going to be a lot more policy driven, less interested in contributing to the academic literature, which in the public policy school here at Maryland, there's always going to be that academic interest in connecting to the literature. Whereas in a think tank, you might see a little bit of that, but it's mostly going to be, how does this connect to like policy on the ground? So there's more of that, which can be very exciting, again, to have that connection. Typically, folks in think tanks have more close and continuing connections with policy officials, either through they invite them to give talks, or they are funded to work on particular projects by a government entity. So you have a much more direct contact day to day, let's say, with policy people than you in academia. Even at Maryland, we're not that far, but there's still a bit, we feel a bit removed, I think, still from folks downtown, just because of the nature of teaching and other things that we do on campus. You know, we don't always have that direct connection. So there's that. I would say the other difference between academia and think tanks is that usually if you work for a think tank, it's soft money funded, which means that you are being paid out of grants, usually funded by some entity, whether it's a government entity or some other funder. And that can definitely affect the kinds of topics and issues and how you might write on issues. So for me, one of the things why I stay in academia and why I love it is because it's really the only place where you can, if you have an idea and you're passionate about it, you can write whatever the heck you want. And for some of my work can tend to be somewhat critical of government and point out sort of gaps and errors and problems. It's a lot easier to do that as an academic. If you work for a think tank or an NGO, you can be critical, but also you have to think about who is funding you, or if you want funding from the agency that you're criticizing, that can mute sometimes what you might say. Whereas an academic, I have less, that's less unless I want certain kinds of funding, but my salary is fully covered by the university. So I don't have to think about that as much as people who work for think tanks or NGOs. But again, I think they're still valuable places to be. I've spent short summers and things at some different NGOs, like the AAAS has offices downtown. And I've spent various summers working in different centers there. And so again, that was useful to kind of see kind of how they operate. And definitely they have a lot more connection to policy than we do in academia. So again, that's a great facet of working for an NGO or think tank.
Okay, I see one last question here in the stack from Nicole, and then we'll end with that one.
Yeah, I actually just had one quick question for you, Rachel and Aditi. How can we join this science policy graduate club?
Fantastic question. Way to join, we go by GSP at UMD for short, Graduate Science Policy at University of Maryland. If you're a University of Maryland student, you can find us on TerpLink. TerpLink is where you can find all student organizations and then we'll put you on our listserv and advertise when our meetings are and when we hold other events, when and where you can find them. You can also find us on Twitter at JSP at UMD, and you can a lot of information about ourselves there too. So I would on Twitter or check us out at our website. And if you are at Maryland, please become a member because we'd love to have you. And with that, I'll also we'll have a second virtual lunch meeting held on April 16th. And it'll be a panel discussion sort of probing this question of how you could make your own science more policy relevant. So hopefully pick up on some of the themes that Dr. Vogel introduced to us here. So we'll be sending out another registration link for that. And if you already joined the call today, we'll send you an email with that information directly. So again, just want to thank you, Dr. Vogel, for spending time with us today. We're adapting to a lot of virtual events, but we're glad we could still hold this one. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And feel free if you want to just email me directly. If you have questions, anyone, feel free to just email me and I'm happy just to chat offline too.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye.